Okay, I'm going to talk about the reading, which is an excerpt from the philosopher Aristotle's work called the Nicomachean Ethics. So it's important. This is different than the readings we've done in the past in this course so far, and it's what we call a primary source reading. So you're reading actually what Aristotle himself wrote, as opposed to, say, me explaining what Aristotle wrote. So the primary source readings are always going to be a little trickier. Obviously, Aristotle did not write in English. He wrote in Greek, so it's translated from the Greek, and of course, there can be many different translations. And so, yes, so just to kind of put this in context, we're working with a primary source, and so the reading should be, you should expect it to be a little trickier. I want to put in context where kind of how Aristotle kind of relates to some of the other philosophers and ideas we've talked about. So one of the most famous utilitarians, John Stuart Mill, you can see his dates there. Immanuel Kant exists there. Thomas Hobbes a little earlier. John Rawls, the social contract theorist, much more contemporary. But you can see, compared to where Aristotle lands on this timeline, they're much later, right? Aristotle is a much earlier philosopher, and it's important to kind of recognize that, because we're talking about a very different time, a very different kind of set of considerations about what ethics is, and so it's important to kind of recognize that going into talking about Aristotle. So even though we've covered Aristotle here in virtue ethics as the last of the normative ethical theories, its origins are in something much earlier, before all of this kind of Enlightenment era philosophy, which is what we have been doing. So, in his work, The Nicomachean Ethics, of which you read book 2, Aristotle is asking a very basic question, which is, how do you become good at something? And his answer to that is, generally, well, you become good at something by practicing it until you've acquired the skill or habit. And Aristotle, interestingly, thinks that it's the exact same way when it comes to being a good person. So you could become good at painting or good at playing football by practicing. And Aristotle thinks it's exactly the same with respect to being a good person, right? Being an ethical person. So he says here, for the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. For example, men become builders by builders and lyre players by playing the lyre. It's a stringed instrument like a guitar. So too, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and brave by doing brave acts. So there's a question that he raises, and it's this. It says the question might be asked, what we mean by saying that we must become just by doing just acts, and temperate by doing temperate acts. For if men do just and temperate acts, they are already just and temperate, exactly as if they do what is in accordance with the laws of grammar and of music, they are grammarians or musicians. So the issue here he's raising is like, hey, it seems like if you're saying that we, in order to become a just person, to have a just character, right, we have to perform just actions. But if you're performing just actions, doesn't that mean you already are a just person, right? That you have a just character? And his answer to that is no. And the reason why is important to see. So Aristotle says here, the agent must be in a certain condition when he performs a virtuous action. In the first place, he must have knowledge. Secondly, he must choose the acts and choose them for their own sakes. And thirdly, his action must proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. So Aristotle here is talking about this idea. He gives an example in the text that, it's possible for a person to do something kind of as a fluke, right, on accident, or do something just by imitating someone else, even though they don't really have the knowledge. So, like, imagine learning a new language. Imagine that you're learning Spanish, and the teacher says, say these sounds, and you say the sounds, whatever they are, right? Say, yo hablo español. And if you say those sounds, then, a Spanish speaker could understand what you're saying. They would understand you to be saying that you speak Spanish. But if you're just imitating the teacher, then you don't really know what you're saying, right? So Aristotle thinks that it's the same with just actions. At first, we're kind of maybe imitating. We don't really have the knowledge of, for example, what courage is. But if we're trying to emulate or imitate someone who does have courage, we might at first kind of merely go through the motions without really understanding what we're doing. And so Aristotle wants to rule out cases like that, right? Those would be the example. That would be an example. You're not yet doing a just action, because a truly just action, right, a truly courageous action, for example, would come from someone who already has that kind of knowledge embedded in them, of what it takes to be courageous, right? And before you get to that state where you have that character, that knowledge and understanding of what courage is, you might at first kind of just go through the motions. Just as if you're learning a language, you might at first just kind of repeat the words without really understanding what the words are, right? So it's really important to grasp, what Aristotle is getting at here. And it's that, you're going to, yes, learn, how to, be a virtuous person, whatever the virtue is, courage or temperance or honesty or whatever it is. At first, you'll be kind of going through the motions and not really understanding, but eventually you will gain that understanding and that knowledge of what the virtue is for yourself. And once you have that, only then can we call your actions courageous or temperate or honest, right? Because only then will you have that kind of deep understanding that comes with that character. So there's another really important thing that Aristotle says, and we'll see illustrated in the example I'm going to use in a second. But from the reading, in section 6, Aristotle says, if 10 pounds are too much for a particular person to eat, and 2 pounds too little, it does not follow that the trainer will order 6 pounds. For this also is perhaps too much for a person who is to take it, or too little. For example, too little for Milo, who apparently was some well-known athlete in ancient Greece. Maybe too little for Milo, but too much for a beginner in athletic exercises. The same is true of running, and he says in wrestling as well. But what he's getting at here is that he's going to eventually, as we'll see, define what virtue is as a mean between two extremes, right? And so he's just thinking here of, the mathematical mean here between 10 and 2 would be 6. 6 would be the middle between 10 and 2, right? But importantly, what he's saying is that the mean has to be relative to us. So that takes into account our particular abilities and needs, and that will differ from person to person, right? And he's going to say, just as this is true in, for example, health, it's also true in the case of virtue. So here is the important passage in section 6 where Aristotle defines what virtue is. And it's this definition that's really the most important thing for you to take from the reading. And I'm going to try to flesh this out in an example. But here's the passage. Virtue, then, is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, i.e., the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now, it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess, and that which depends on defect. So, what is Aristotle getting at here? Well, what he's getting at is something like this. He's saying that virtue is a mean, a midpoint between two extremes, right? There's going to be a vice of excess, and there's going to be a vice of defect. So kind of generally, we can think about this in a kind of a Goldilocks way. the famous fairy tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where Goldilocks happens upon this bear's cottage and finds this porridge and bowls, right? And some of it's too hot, some of it's too cold, and some of it's just right. So this is how Aristotle is thinking about what a virtue is, right? Virtue is that perfect kind of middle point between something that kind of lacks or something that has too much of something. So we can think about then the vice of defect as having kind of too little of something, the vice of excess having too much of something. So let's look at this then using an example, courage. So this is just one virtue. We could do a similar illustration with any different kind of virtue you want to talk about, right? I mean, honesty can be a virtue, right? Modesty can be a virtue. So what I think is really fascinating about Aristotle's idea that virtue is a mean between two extremes is that it will force us to kind of maybe think differently about what these virtues are. And that's the kind of main point of this lecture. So suppose that we pick courage. Courage is a kind of virtue, right? And if courage is, as Aristotle says, a mean between two extremes, then it should be this kind of midpoint where on either side of it are different kinds of vices, right? So in this case, it's easy to come up with what it means to not have enough courage, right? We have a word for that. It's being a coward. The having kind of too much courage is a trickier one. Usually the vice of excess is always kind of a trickier one to come up with because, virtues are positively, they're words that have a positive connotation. So having courage is a good thing. So how can you have too much of a good thing? But if Aristotle's right, you can, right? Because virtue is a mean between two extremes. And so to speak, having too much courage is also a thing, and that's a vice, right? And so we can use the term rashness or being rash to define that idea of having too much courage. But notice here, what have we really defined here when we've said, okay, you can have too little of the thing, too much of a thing, but then just the right amount of the thing. But of course, what we want to know is, well, what is that thing? What is courage, right? Such that you can have too little of it and too much of it. So I think it's helpful here to have some examples. So this is going to be the crucial thing. I'm going to ask you guys to do this, both in discussion and on the second exam, to give me your own illustration of a virtue. And what's really important to do in analyzing the particular virtue is to come up with examples. So what would be an example of someone acting in a cowardly way, right? And here's my example. For example, someone who, although they are an excellent swimmer, is too afraid to jump into the river to save a drowning child, right? What about the other end of the spectrum here? What's the vice of excess look like? Well, that might be something like this. Someone who, even though they cannot swim at all, jumps into the river to save the drowning child with no fear at all. So that's someone who that would be our example of someone who has, quote unquote, too much courage, too much of a good thing, right? Because again, if a virtue is a mean between two extremes, you're always going to have these extremes as vices, right? That's what you want to avoid. Whereas the virtue is the thing in the middle, right? So, okay, if these are our examples of having too little and having too much, right? Then it seems that courage must have something to do with correctly proportioning, on the one hand, one's ability in the situation at hand to the fear that they should feel given that ability, right? So let's think of courage then in this way. Courage is feeling the right amount of fear in the situation and then acting accordingly, right? Because fear, is important. It can be an indicator of what we kind of should or shouldn't do in situations, right? And so courage has something to do with kind of mastering fear and putting it in the right proportion to the other things. So what counts as the right amount of fear for someone to feel is determined both by a person's knowledge of their own abilities and by an understanding of the situation. So in our examples, right, the person who actually really is a good swimmer, but still has fear, is not feeling the right amount of fear, right? Maybe they're perfectly capable and it's okay. They're going to be fine if they jump into the river because they are a really good swimmer. Whereas the person who's rash, right, who kind of feels no fear, even though they're jumping into this swiftly moving river and they have no ability to swim, it's someone, that rash person is someone who lacks a certain kind of understanding of themselves. And that's a really important component of what it is to possess a virtue for Aristotle, right? Because that idea of the mean and the mean relative to us requires that we have some understanding both of our own abilities and of the kind of situation in which we're applying our abilities, right? So then let's define objective fearfulness as how much fear a person should feel given their knowledge of the situation and of their abilities. And then we'll define subjective fearfulness as how much fear the person actually feels. And so those two things could get out of whack in the following ways. So let's think about courage then. Think of it as a kind of proportioning what I've called the objective fearfulness to the subjective fear that a person actually feels in the situation. So the idea is that the person who has courage is proportioning that in the right way, right? So suppose it's a kind of swiftly moving river. The person is a good swimmer. They recognize that there is some kind of, fear. There is some danger in the situation, but they understand their abilities. They understand, perhaps also equally important, they understand the kind of the stakes in the situation, that there's a kid's life in danger, right? And so taking that all into account, right, they act based, and they proportion that kind of the fear, the objective fearfulness to this subjective fear in the situation. So as we see here, if we think about this as an equation of sorts, we're coming at the virtue, courage, is coming out close to 1. Whereas the vices of excess and defect are coming out all kind of out of whack, right? So the person who's a coward, the objective fearfulness might be low, but the subjective fearfulness that it's low for them given their abilities. Suppose they're actually a good swimmer, right? But the fear that they feel is way too high. It's out of whack from what they should feel, right? So there's the vice of defect. The vice of excess is the exact opposite, right? So the person who has no knowledge of how to swim, or kind of, how kind of fearful they should be in the situation given how swiftly the river is flowing and given that they have no abilities, right? The actual kind of fearfulness they should be feeling is actually quite high, but they don't actually feel any, right? So that's out of whack in the opposite direction. So that's Aristotle on this idea that virtue is a mean between two extremes. So what you should be doing is kind of thinking about how you can give your own analysis of a virtue, something different than courage, to illustrate your understanding of Aristotle's idea that virtue is a mean between two extremes.